on complete.
I'm Tom Alderman.
Good morning, Mr. Hussein.
That the people of British Columbia cannot, by looking at the issues that are before them, by reviewing the leadership and the candidates that are before them, decide for themselves who should be government. And that may well be this party, the party I represent, the Liberal Party.
All right, Mr. Wilson, thank you very much. Thank you, Vaughn Palmer. I've drawn the lot for the fourth rotation, and leading off is the Premier. Madam Premier, I'm hoping you can help me out on something. I'm somewhat confused. On the one hand, with some pride, you associate yourself with your government's economic record of the past 5 years. On the other hand, you distance yourself from the government's scandal record. On the ethics issue, you have repeatedly asked voters to judge you on your record. Same government. Why should voters make a distinction?
Well, the choice British Columbians have before them at this time is a government led by Rita Johnston. And the people of this province have every right to expect the very highest level of honesty and integrity from their elected officials, regardless of which level. I've made it very clear since I was sworn in as Premier. I've made it clear to the incumbents and to new candidates that I expect that very high standard of integrity in people that work on my team. You know, we have the toughest conflict of interest legislation in Canada. We have strict guidelines, and we are giving the people of British Columbia an opportunity by way of referendum to fire their MLA through recall if that's what they want to do. I've had some tough choices to make since I was sworn in as Premier, and I've made them. Mike's had some tough choices to make, and he's run away from them. Is that leadership?
All right, Mrs. Johnston and Mr. Harcourt, you have the opportunity for a response.
Well, again, I would hope we would get away from the distortions and the name-calling and get back to the issues. And the fact is, election, it's the people of British Columbia who put ethics and integrity as the #1 issue in this election. Mrs. Johnston has been forced to admit that. This election is about the record of the last 5 years. And the record of the last 5 years is a record of abuse of office, of waste and misplaced priorities. Mrs. Johnston says that a vote for her is to bring in a strong conflict of interest laws. Well, her Attorney General, Russ Froese, said he wants to weaken the conflict of interest laws. We have a record of 16 conflicts, of 13 cabinet resignations, and of 10 cases of unethical conduct. And Mrs. Johnston has been running this campaign the way that her government ran the last 5 years. We've had charges, lawsuits, distortions, and finally, desperate panic.
Mr. Wilson.
Well, let me tell you what the Liberal Party would like to do. It's our view that in order for us to have a system of government that can restore faith and confidence in the people of this province, we have to make some fundamental changes to government. I feel, for example, that the recommendations that came from the Law Reform Commission with respect to the Office of Attorney General this morning are excellent ideas that need to be considered. The implementation, for example, of the Exchequer, which we have put forward, which would remove the individual who is a single spending authority and control of that from Cabinet, remove the discretionary spending from ministries, allow ministries to essentially have a budget that is established with a fixed budget day by law so that government has to adhere to rules and regulation, make sure that the people of British Columbia are adequately and properly represented with a fixed budget day and a fixed election day, and by having a fixed election day, know that the term is mandated so that people can restore the faith and confidence in government. Those are the kinds of things we're talking about in terms of government reform.
Mr. Wilson, thank you very much. And before I introduce the Premier for a 30-second rebuttal, may I say that this is, with the greatest of respect, that this is sounding more and more like your paid political announcements. That is not the intention of this forum. Again, with the fact it is to have a debate between the leaders, and I would encourage you to engage in that debate. Mrs. Johnston.
Well, I don't in any way condone any behavior that eventually results in some type of legal action. But, you know, it shows that the system works. And nobody has a monopoly on virtue, not even you, Mike Harcourt. Mike can call me a liar. He can question my integrity, but I can tell you, and the people, the viewers, I have served in public office for 20 years, and I've never lied to the people that I've been representing. And I don't intend to start doing that now.
I have the option now of follow-up, and I would ask that follow-up to the Premier, if I may. But you are asking people to elect a Rita Johnston government, not just Rita Johnston. And people are, perhaps rightly so, wondering where was Rita Johnston when these scandals of the last 5 years were occurring. We were around the cabinet table, you were rubbing shoulders with these people. At no point did you feel a tinge of speak out.
Well, you don't know, Kevin, what I said internally, but I can tell you that we did not, as members of caucus or cabinet, have all of the information with regard to Bill Vander Zalm and Fantasy Gardens, and that's what you're talking about, until the Hughes report was tabled. So I had access to that information at precisely the same time that you did. It was then that action was taken in our caucus.
Any response?
Well, Kevin, I've made a commitment to the toughest conflict of interest laws in Canada.
We have them now.
That Mrs. Johnston's Attorney General wants to weaken. But we have looked at all the conflict laws in Canada. I would bring in the toughest. If a politician doesn't know that he or she is there to serve the public interest, they're gone. Now, Mrs. Johnston had a choice when Bill Vander Zalm had to resign in disgrace. The choice that she made was to say that Bill Vander Zalm resigned with dignity. Thank you, Bill Vander Zalm. Well, I think that Mrs. Johnston, it's not that whether you're telling the truth or not, Mrs. Johnston, it's that you did have a choice. Your judgment on the John Ball resignation was there. You could have very clearly disassociated yourself in the first day. It's not whether you're telling the truth or not, it's your judgment that I'm questioning.
Mr. Wilson.
Well, it seems to me that we have a certain amount of piety on the one hand and retribution on the other hand. These two political parties have so conspired in this province, they can come together and agree on. For example, we talk about honesty and integrity in government. How honest was it for a Board of Internal Economy to provide a severance deal for people that are elected to office in this province for $22,000 to $45,000, both accepted by both your parties, never taken to the legislature, no public accounting? That's fundamentally dishonest. It's a dishonest way to proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Wilson. Vaughn Palmer, your turn for a question to the leader of the NDP.
Mr. Harcourt, there's been a lot of talk in this campaign about SOCRED scandals. I'd like to see how you're going to handle one of yours. A little over a year ago, the Deputy Attorney General of Alberta recommended that Mo Sahota, the MLA from the Esquimalt, be charged with a serious criminal offense. Will you promise tonight that if you were elected Premier, Mo Sahota will not be made Attorney General of British Columbia?
Well, first of all, those charges were not proceeded with. And Mr. Sahota was cleared by the Law Society, and I presume we still have a presumption of innocence in this province. I think that Mo Sahota faced a very tough decision, a very difficult decision, and made the right choices. And because of that, Bill Reid is no longer in office, and Bud Smith is gone. I think that was a difficult decision that Mo handled the right way. I'm not going to make decisions about who's going to be chosen to cabinet because, Vaughn, I wouldn't want to prejudge the people of this province. I want to see who is chosen as an MLA and whether I have the privilege of being the Premier of this province. But I can tell you I'm going to expect the toughest and the highest standards from members of my cabinet if I become the Premier. That's why I'm prepared to bring in the toughest conflict laws. That's why I'm prepared to bring in laws that cover post-ministerial employment so that for 24 months you cannot be engaged in activities in the area where you had access to information.
Gordon Wilson, do you have a response to the question put to Mr. Harcourt?
Well, I think that the question is a good one, and it seems to me that there needs to be some provision taken to make sure that those people that are elected to office are going to be able to perform in the highest standards possible. As I say, it's easy for politicians at election time to proceed in this kind of level of rhetoric. The point is, until such time as we make sure that there is a very clear mandate set down with very clear directives in government, I don't believe that you're going to be able to solve these problems. We talk about the toughest conflicts of interest regulations. What we need to do, and what the people of British Columbia need to do, is to put in place politicians. Hire the people that have, in fact, honesty and integrity from the beginning. Make sure that they don't simply go forward and, in a knee-jerk reaction, react to a very bad government by electing a party that is only marginally better.
Mrs. Johnston.
Well, I find it very interesting that Mr. Harcourt would suggest there should be a presumption of innocence when it applies to NDP members, but that same presumption of innocence shouldn't apply to members of the Social Credit Party. You had problems with Mr. Sahota. Glenn Clark used information obtained illegally from private tax returns. And Mike Harcourt, I'm telling you tonight, you didn't have the guts to deal with those issues. You're not a leader, and you can't deal with members in your own caucus who behave other than what we expect from an elected official. So presumption of innocence should apply to everybody, not just to NDP members.
Fortunately, it's your turn to have a rebuttal.
Well, I couldn't agree more with the Premier. I just wish she'd practice what she preached. That presumption of innocence, and as I said, I wish we'd get away from the name calling and the distortions and deal with the issues. I think that's what this debate is all about. And I think, Mrs. Johnston, you're right. The presumption of innocence should apply to every citizen.
And
that's why it should apply to Bill Vander Zalm, it should apply to Bill Reid, and it should apply to Jack Kemp. Yet you lifted Jack Kemp's membership. You didn't lift the memberships to the other two. They're all facing charges or lawsuits. I say that presumption is very real. I believe in it very passionately. Let's apply it to every citizen. Let's not use it for some who are your friends and others who aren't.
Vaughn Palmer.
Mr. Harcourt, I too am surprised to hear you talk about the presumption of innocence. I've seen your television ads. You've got an ad that mentions Lyle Hansen. He was never charged with a crime. You've got Cliff Michael. He was never charged. You've got Bud Smith. He was never charged. Why does Mr. Sahota have no cloud over his head? You said he wasn't charged, yet the Deputy AG of Alberta said he should have been charged.
But he was the point. The law enforcement officials in this province chose not to proceed. They chose not to proceed against Bud Smith. The ads that we put before the people of British Columbia deal with the issue of integrity in government, that the same standard should apply. Now, Mr. Sahota is going to be facing the voters in his riding. The voters in his riding will make that judgment on whether they want him to represent. It won't be Rita Johnston or myself or Gordon Wilson. I'm saying that presumption of innocence should apply. It didn't apply with Mrs. Johnston to Jack Kemp. It did apply to Bill Vander Zalm and to Bill Reid. That's wrong.
Russ Froese, you have a question for Gordon Wilson.
Yes, this is a question to Gordon Wilson and to all the leaders. I mean, we started out with the suggestion that we should be talking about the issues tonight. The issue tonight has been leadership and honesty, integrity in government. Our polls you've shown and other polls have shown that that is the #1 issue. But beyond that, there's a disillusionment. There's a cynicism about politics now among the voter. People are tired of scandals on one hand, but they're also tired of empty promises from the politicians, the polarized politics in this province, the conflict, on and on and on. Now, we've heard about promises about tough conflict of interest guidelines, but beyond that, and I'm saying beyond that, what do you do to restore voter faith, trust, and confidence in this province? Please address that to the voter.
Well, I think, Russ, that's an excellent question, and it's one that I've certainly had as I travel around the province from many British Columbians. I believe what we have to do is we have to reform the way we are governed. I don't believe that simply switching one party for another in a legislature that's already dominated by polarized politics is going to do anything to change the system. What we have to do is we have to reform government to make government more accountable, more accessible to people. Our policy position papers do that. It provides the people, for example, with MLAs that have a free vote so that they know that their voice is heard in the House. We're talking about the establishment of a reformed government that has a single spending authority with full accountability, so that the people know with a full and open accounting of how their tax monies are spent. They know that their tax money is spent wisely. And we're also talking about the integration of ministries and putting them back to the community level so that people can access government at the community level, so that they know that they have accessible government, honest government, and government that is accounted for in an open and public accounting. Those are the kinds of things people want to see. They want to know their money is going to be spent well, and our policies say so. We're the only party here that's talking about significant government reform.
All right, Premier Johnston, your response to Russ Froese's question or to the statement from Mr. Wilson.
Government must provide strong leadership, but government also has to be responsive to the people. No question about that. And you know, we have heard, as everyone else has as we travel the province, they want better government. They don't want bigger government. And that's one of the concerns that the people in this province have. But we have a Conflict of Interest Act. We have an all-party legislative committee dealing with ethical conduct. We have the Referendum Act. We have the Constitutional Amendment Approval Act, Canada's only public list of polluters. We have a Senatorial Selection Act. Future initiatives, direct democracy, the recall and the initiative referendum, free votes in the legislature, better access to your MLAs, access to Information and Privacy Act. You know, we will lead, but the people have to be there with us. And that's the way we have always operated. That's the way we will continue to operate, involving the people by way of referendum if they make the decision that that's what they want to see done.
Mike Harcourt.
Well, the question of restoring of trust between people who are putting themselves forward as candidates to be elected and their fellow citizens is very important, Russ, or Kevin, and it's something that I have believed in very passionately as a mayor, as an alderman, and now as the MLA for Vancouver Centre and hopefully soon Vancouver Mount Pleasant. That's why I have put a platform of open, honest, and fair government that brings in tough conflict laws, freedom of information laws without 64 exemptions as we have right now with Mrs. Johnston's government, disclosure of campaign funds, limits on campaign funds, and a series of other initiatives to open up government, let it breathe. I was an open-door mayor. I believed in public participation. That is the kind of government I would like to bring about. I've suggested that in our land use disputes and our various conflicts in the watersheds throughout British Columbia, that we have an environment and jobs accord where we get British Columbians to sit down and work out instead of having a civil war in every watershed in British Columbia. Restoring integrity, providing opportunities for participation, and having your record before the people and doing what you say you're going to do before the election and after the election.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Harcourt. Mr. Wilson, your opportunity for a rebuttal.
Well, with all due respect to Mr. Harcourt, we're not electing a mayor of BC. We want a premier that has vision and a leadership. And with due respect to Rita, I've said publicly before, and I'll say it in front of all British Columbia, you were a good Minister of Municipal Affairs. I don't think that that's doubtful. But you have behind you the same Delta Surrey backroom gang that were behind Bill Vanderzam. And you have essentially as...
Would you name names, please? Because
I don't think I need to name
well,
names,
I think
Rita.
You should. I think you should.
It's open for any to see.
Yes,
What
I'd
we
like
have
the
to
names,
have, what
please.
we have to have, is a change in the way government is delivered in this province, because people no longer have faith that a two-party system, which can only provide majority government, can work. That minority government this time around is not a bad option.
Russ, does that answer your first question?
Not really.
Well, you have a shot at a follow-up
I'll
if you
try
like.
a rebuttal with Mr. Harcourt. Now, Mr. Harcourt, you've talked about openness, honesty, trusting, all the things that I'm suggesting a lot of voters are very concerned about in this campaign. Yet, the predominant theme during this campaign, through your ads, through your messages, has been negativity, knocks on the Socreds. There seems to be a contradiction in terms here.
Well, I don't think so at all, Russ. I think talking about Bill Vanderzam resigning in disgrace, or Bill Reid's insider dealing, or Jack Kemp's breach of trust is negative campaigning at all. That's negative government. That's what I'm talking about. That's what we need to change in British Columbia.
So much for presumption of innocence.
That's why British Columbians are saying it's time for a change.
Why not take the high road?
I've said that there are a number of changes that we can make. I hope 4 or 5 of those in our open and honest government. The reforms that we want to bring about in British Columbia. But the government's record is fair to put before the people of British Columbia. Do you want 5 more years like the last 5 years? And I think most British Columbians are saying, no, it's time for a change.
Mrs. Johnston.
Well, in the past 5 years, I doubt if the people of this province have ever been invited to participate more with decisions made by their government. We've had royal commissions on education and on health care, forest resource commissions, Parks 90, the Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, wilderness studies. We've had Mrs. Grand traveling the province talking to people about women about women's issues. We have never before included the general population in the decision making prior to those decisions being made. They've never been involved before. We do have government in British Columbia.
Mr. Wilson.
Well, Russ, I'm having difficulty finding how I can answer your question any more directly than I have. I'm suggesting to you that by simply having a knee-jerk reaction and trading places in the legislature between two parties that have constantly been in conflict, that will not agree to a good idea when it comes up from the other side on principle because they're constantly in an election mode, is part of the reason that you have such a tremendous jaundiced feeling by people in the province of British Columbia. People definitely want change, and the only way to do that is to break away from a two-party system and to elect a new political option with a new vision for a new British Columbia.
Mr. Wilson, thank you very much. And before I introduce Vaughn Palmer, who has a question for Rita Johnston, I realize that this is the first time in British Columbia history that we have had all three leaders together during an election campaign, and that debates are a new and foreign concept to politicians in British Columbia on television. But again, I would encourage you, as we are well into our second half here, that your comments to each other, we'll be happy to listen. Vaughn Palmer to Rita Johnston.
Madam Premier, and I'd like to apologize for the fact that the first woman Premier doesn't get a question from a woman member on the panel. But anyway, here we go.
I'll accept your apology.
Your finance minister admitted this week that for all the tricks and budget stabilization funds, over the last 5 years, the social credit government has run a deficit of $1.3 billion. And the government right now is involved by the end of the budget year in trying to borrow well over $1 billion, which will push the direct debt of the province to record levels. Now, given that underwhelming record over the last 5 years, I'm wondering why voters should believe you when you say you're going to balance the budget over the next 5.
Well, I'd like to look at this from the point of view of the taxpayer. I'm the only candidate in this election campaign that has been talking about taxes and tax reduction. The only candidate that's been doing that.
Well, that's not so.
And it's really interesting because if you look at the NDP platform, all of their comments will result in additional taxation. But you know, we have seen tax relief over the past few years, and we do have the lowest government debt in all of Canada. We have the highest credit rating in all of Canada. We've reduced our sales tax. We've lowered our school property tax. And we have new supplementary homeowners grants. We do have one of the very lowest overall tax burdens in all of Canada. And we've still been able to increase funding for education and healthcare and social services. So I believe that we have done an excellent job of managing the finances of the people of this province.
Mike Harcourt, I have a feeling you might not agree.
Well, when I was talking about distortions, Kevin, I was dealing with two distortions. First of all, the distortion called the Budget Stabilization, the S Fund. And I think the same official that's been advising this government was advising them when they tried to say that we had a $400 million deficit when it was really $1.2 billion and now $1.3 billion. And to deflect attention away from the fact that Mrs. Johnston's first act was to bring in the highest deficit in this province's history, she and John Jansen got up and talked about just a huge whopper of a distortion that our platform would result in a $15 billion deficit. Well, I can tell you my commitment is to a balanced budget. I balanced budgets 6 years in a row as mayor in very difficult times. Oh. That's my record. My record is very clear. I think that Mrs. Johnston's first act was to bring in the largest deficit in this province's history.
Mr. Wilson.
Well, let me first of all say, Mike, that as mayor, you have to by law, and the way you did it was by raising taxes. In the last 4 years of your term as mayor, you increased industrial taxes 52%, you increased the commercial taxes 51%. So, I mean, there's no miracle to balance if you're prepared to simply go and raise the taxes to do so, and that statistically is evident by your record as mayor. But let me suggest that we are not suggesting here that we're going to balance the budget, because I think it's inherently dishonest for a politician in this day to stand here and say that they're going to balance a budget, and particularly to say they're going to do it over 5 years. It's patent nonsense. We have to have a way to make sure that we in government spend the money wisely, and it's important for us to make sure that we establish spending priorities that invest in the people of British Columbia. It is my view that the people of British Columbia want to know that their money is spent wisely. An exchequer, a single spending authority removing waste and duplication in government will do that, and therefore be able to provide for the people excellent expenditures on the basis of revenues that do come in on an annual basis.
Madam Premier?
Well, I just want to reiterate, we've heard Mike talking about how he balanced the budget when he was the mayor of Vancouver. Well, there's a law in the books. It was brought in by the provincial government. Big deal, Mike. Every mayor in this province has a balanced budget. No choice at all. But you know, I've never once heard you talk about reducing the size or scope of government, Mike. Everything you say leads to higher taxes, increased spending, and your statement that you're going to balance the budget is got to be the biggest fabrication and dishonesty of the entire campaign. And I'm still waiting for you to come up with the numbers. What are your promises going to cost the taxpayers of this province? You can smile all you want,
Madam Premier,
but we want the numbers.
That's time. Vaughn Palmer, you have a follow-up?
Well, the follow-up is for the Premier, as was the first question. You've said Mr. Harcourt hasn't spelled out his promises. During the leadership race, you promised you were going to back up Tax Freedom Day a whole month. And we had somebody at the Froese Institute work that out, and he said that would knock about 20% out of the provincial budget at least. How are you going to pay for that one? What 20% of what programs are you going to cut in order to keep that promise?
I made it clear that that was a goal I had set, and that would be accomplished in our mandate. It would not be accomplished in the first year. But I also made a commitment that in our very first budget, we would be eliminating the property purchase tax as it applied to the first-time home buyers. That amounts to $60 million. We have made that commitment, and it's the only firm tax reduction commitment that we have made, and that will be happening in our very first budget.
Russ Froese, your question now to the leader of the NDP, Mike Harcourt.
Well, while we're on the subject of promises, Mr. Harcourt, you and your party have issued a lot of promises. There was a booklet that came out with 48 of them 2 days into the campaign. And at the same time, you've made it clear that some of those promises might have to be delayed for you to keep your commitment of balancing the budget over the 5-year cycle. Now, I think the voters would specifically like to know your priorities, and can you specifically name the top 5 promises that you want to see if you're elected to a term and cost them?
Well, that's why I put out the platform in the first day of the election campaign and the fiscal framework that said we would give a sense of direction, what our priorities were, Russ. One of the first priorities is to bring open and honest government to British Columbia. That doesn't cost any money. I've outlined all the particular areas that we want to do that. I promised to cut down on waste and get our spending priorities right. For example, losing $294 million on the sale of the Expo lands is a terrible waste of money. That takes funds away from feeding hungry school children, from dealing with the portables in our schools, the waiting lists for heart surgery and for cancer treatment. Now, I've made it very clear as mayor, I balanced the budget. Yes, I had to do it by law. And yes, as the leader of the opposition, hopefully Premier, I am committed to a balanced budget over the next 5 years, because I backed a law provincially that says we have to balance. That's why I put out a fiscal framework so that those priorities that are laid out in our platform can be realized. We're not promising miracles. I've said we can't do it all at once. We'll only do what British Columbians can afford.
Gordon Wilson.
Well, I don't know. I'm confused by that response, Mike. I guess the answer is no. You're not prepared to outline the top 5 and what they're going to cost. Clearly, what we have to recognize here, and I think that what's important for people to understand, is if you say that you're only going to be providing what the people can afford, to what extent are you prepared to increase taxes to make it affordable? That's number one. And to number 2, what are you going to do in order to make the government more accountable to the people in terms of an open spending program that has a full accountability? Now, we have talked about this in absolute specific terms, because it's our view, it is our feeling that in fact we can and must, if we are to be competitive in the province of British Columbia, get the taxman off the back of the people of British Columbia. It is the single greatest need we have if we're going to have a solid, viable economic growth in this province. And yet I don't hear either of the other 2 leaders talking about what they're going to do in terms of tax reform that will start to give tax relief to the people and stop the lineups down across the border to get people to down there doing business instead of up here.
The ball's over to you, Madam Premier.
Well, I want to respond to the one comment with regard to the sale of the Expo land. You know, we bought that land for $4 a foot, Mike. We ran a successful fair on it. More than 20 million people came to town. You opposed that, but we paid $4 a foot for it, and we sold it for $120 a foot. I know that's economics, and you may have a problem with it, but in my books, that is a good deal. And your promises are going to cost $314 a month for every family of 4 in this province for 5 years, a total debt of $15.3 billion. And if you don't agree with the figures that we've come up with, why don't you give us your numbers?
Well, I have. I laid it out in the first day of the election.
What are the numbers?
What I'm waiting for is a balanced budget over the next 5 years that will set tough priorities. And Mrs. Johnson, we're waiting for you to tell people how you're going to.
What about the promises?
We're asking. That's
about
the fiscal framework, and that is our. Those are our commitments.
This is the fiscal framework
Mrs.
here.
Johnson, you still
and
have
they
not.
don't add up.
You
These
still have
two
not
don't
told.
add
You still
up.
have not told the people of British Columbia how you're going to make up for the $1.2 billion in cuts by Brian Mulroney. You still haven't told the people of British Columbia how you're going to bring in user fees and who you're going to tax in terms of our health care system. You're the one that has to come clean to the people of British Columbia.
Why don't you stop scaring the senior citizens of this province with your lies?
Who you're going to tax. You were the one that introduced the property purchase tax for first-time home buyers.
That's
to take
right.
it away now, when I voted against it in the first place, is a bit much, Mrs. Johnston. You shouldn't have introduced it and hurt young British Columbians trying to buy their first home in the first place.
You're skating around it, but we want the numbers, Mike. We want the numbers.
I've told you the numbers. The
You don't
bottom
have any
line is a
numbers.
balanced budget.
You're afraid of the numbers.
We'll set tough priorities above the line, and the bottom line is a balanced budget.
You're
Well, I'll
gutless.
tell you
You
this-
won't give us the numbers.
I
This
gave them to
reminds
you.
me of the legislature, and here's a classic example of why nothing ever gets done in the province of British Columbia. Right here, you saw it live on CBC.
Well, it's easy to
Wilson?
sit on the sidelines, Mr. Wilson, and to catcall and cajole. I've been involved in public
ladies.
life for 20 years in setting budgets and
Mr.
being
Harcourt.
elected over and over again. I understand balanced budgets.
With respect, I have
Wishy-washy.
to interrupt. And we all are competing to get the last word in here. This debate isn't over yet. I have a question now for Gordon Wilson, and it has to do with something that is very, very important for whoever is the next premier of this province. I'm talking about the future of Canada. Surprisingly, during this election campaign, we have had very little discussion on the constitutional proposals that have been tabled in Ottawa. And I would like to know your position on the distinct society as defined by Ottawa. Does this constitute a special deal for Quebec? And if so, does it make Brian Mulroney's constitutional package unacceptable?
In a short answer, the word is yes, it does. And I tell you that I have looked at this issue, as many British Columbians know, as the most serious, the most pressing issue facing British Columbians and, in fact, all Canadians. Part of the difficulty that we have now is the fact that the legislatures in the past, in the Meech Lake Accord, voted for a package which essentially gave distinct society as an option within the constitutional framework. The people of Quebec, because they heard, for example, from a Michael Harcourt and a Bill Vander Zalm, who passionately spoke in favor and voted for it, heard that it was acceptable in legislatures in Western Canada. So for us to now turn around and say, no, it isn't, is a difficult thing to do. But if we're going to have a constitution that has any kind of authority in this country, it seems to me there has to be three principles. One, every Canadian is equal to every other Canadian. Two, every province has equal legislative status with every other province. And number three, that in a reformed upper house, that the people of British Columbia have equal legislative authority through equal representation.
Madam Premier.
Well, I believe, Kevin, that Mr. Mulroney's package is a document for discussion. But we have had an all-party committee from our legislature traveling the province, and we've learned a couple of things. The people of British Columbia want to have a say prior to any final decision being made, as it applies to changes in the Constitution of Canada. We, therefore, brought in a referendum, and we are required to put any changes to a vote of the people in this province. But, you know, they also told us they want us to work to keep Canada together and to keep Canada whole. But no special deals, no special privileges. All regions must participate in the discussion. And it's on that basis that we will, after the election, reinstate our all-party committee and ensure that the people of British Columbia are very much involved and have full participation and a say in what is going to happen if there are going to be changes in the Constitution.
Mr. Harcourt, your response to the question regarding the Constitution.
I believe that Canadians want to see a renewed and reconstituted country. I believe that most British Columbians understand that Quebec has a distinct language, culture, and legal system, but there should be no special status for any provinces. But I think there's other issues that British Columbians are interested in other than the Constitution, Kevin, and I think the whole issue of good quality Medicare across Canada, particularly here in British Columbia, is also as important. That's why I have said no to new user fees. Mrs. Johnston's record on that issue is very clear. I think that
Michael, let's not duck this issue.
There is more to this country than a constitution. It is an important issue, and I have said very clearly to Columbians, I didn't interrupt you, Mr. Wilson, and I don't intend you to interrupt me.
The question was on the Constitution,
I have
not
made an
user
issue on the
fees in medicine.
Constitution, and I have said there is more to Canada than the Constitution. Yes, we will renew Canada. That means that the user fees that Mrs. Johnston has talked about, she said that I have no problem with user fees, and you go into a hospital, you're expected to buy a service. I see nothing wrong with expecting to pay for a portion of those fees. It's very clear in her position, mine is too. Do you want to have our Medicare system for all British Columbians, or do you want the Americanized social credit user pay system where you pay at the door? Take your pick.
I have to allow that because that is his time. Mr. Wilson, you have 30 seconds for a rebuttal.
Well, the credit card trick is cute, Mike, but it doesn't address a very serious issue here. You had an opportunity to speak out on behalf of British Columbians and indeed Western Canadians during the Meech Lake Accord. You didn't even listen to the Aboriginal voice in your caucus when Larry Ganu stood up and asked you, pleaded with you in the most passionate speech in the legislature to vote against that accord. When Darlene Mazzari stood up and spoke on behalf of children and said how bad that Meech Lake Accord was going to be, you ignored Darlene Mazzari. How can anybody believe you now, Michael? You certainly did not stand up and speak out for British Columbians then. Why on earth should they trust you now?
Russ Froese, do you have a follow-up question? We have time just for 30-second responses each from the leaders before we go to closing statements.
Well, I was still waiting for my rebuttal question on trying to get Mr. Harcourt to list his top 5 priorities. I got 2 of them.
I listed them at the beginning, Russ. I said that I have been around this province talking about quality health care. I have dealt with open and balanced government, about a sustainable economy. I have mentioned that we need to carry out those priorities within a balanced budget, and the bottom line is if you don't have the funding, you can't spend it.
Well,
I have throughout this campaign laid out the issues that I've just outlined to you.
And they're going to
3
cost
of the issues I've
$15
just talked
billion.
to you about now. I don't think bringing in open and honest government costs money. I think we can cut out the waste so that we can carry out the priorities laid out in the first day of the election campaign. You asked for the priorities, I've given you the priorities.
You've given me 2 of them, Mr. Harcourt.
I've given you 3. Open and honest government. I have said that we need high-quality health care. I've been dealing with education.
Where are you going to get that $1.2 billion that you want to spend in addition on health care?
I have said that very clearly, and I laid it out in the first day in the fiscal framework. I have said, Russ, I have said that the cuts from Mr. Mulroney will be made up in 2 ways. The impact of that so that our kids don't go to school hungry, so that we don't have homeless in the streets. I have said we'll have a higher income surcharge, a minimum corporate tax. Mrs. Johnston still hasn't said who she's going to tax to make up for those cuts.
I'm afraid I've got to interject again because I know that you all want to get your closing statements in, and it is time now for 1-minute closing statements. And again, the order has been drawn by lot, and Gordon Wilson has drawn to speak first.
Well, thank you. At the beginning of this evening, I said that on October the 17th, the people of this country, this province, have a serious choice to make. What you have witnessed tonight is exactly the reason why it is so important that we break from a 2-party, polarized system, a system that does not look to vision for a future British Columbia. Over the next 4 years, British Columbians are going to be faced with very, very serious questions, notwithstanding the fact that some of those questions will be driven from factors that are affecting us from abroad, from south of the border, and indeed, yes, the province of Quebec. It is time that British Columbia had leadership with vision. It is time that British Columbia broke away from the 2-party conspiracy that has kept the people shackled into such conflict that the interests of the people, you, British Columbians, have been so poorly served. It is my view that now is the time for British Columbians to seize a glorious opportunity to state that enough is indeed enough, and yes, we do want change. But not just a change from one side of the legislature to another. We want to change the system by which government is delivered. And we want to have compassionate government with vision to a future for British Columbians. Now is this time Liberal in the province of British Columbia for real significant change. Thank you.
Rita Johnston, your closing statement, please.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, I know you must be disappointed with this debate. I did hope that Mr. Harcourt would tell us what his promises would cost, but he hasn't done that. And at the outset of this campaign, I made it very clear I would not be making any promises that I didn't intend to keep. Mr. Harcourt certainly can't make that statement. But you know, Mike, there's still time for you to be honest with the people. We should debate again. I believe we should debate again, and I understand BCTV has sent us an invitation. Maybe we could come back on CBC. I'm sure Mr. Wilson would want to participate, and we should have the Green Party. I'm prepared to make that commitment to debate next Monday. How about you? And bring those numbers with you, because the people of this province deserve to know what your promises are going to cost them by way of additional taxation.
Mr. Harcourt.
Well, thank you, Kevin. As I said at the beginning, I'd hope we'd be able to address the issues that are important to British Columbians and not get involved in name-calling and in distortions. And from the beginning of this campaign, I've laid out what I thought were the issues facing British Columbians, a 48-point platform within a fiscal framework of a balanced budget. My record is clear as mayor. Our commitment to balanced budgets is very clear. I have said that this election is about time for a change. Change from a government that's put the interests of themselves and their friends ahead of those of British Columbians. Time for a change to a government that is going to listen to you, is going to represent your interests. to change from a government that wants to Americanize our health care system to a two-tiered health care system, to a government that believes in Medicare, that is available to all our citizens. It's time to change from a government that is going to interfere with your personal moral decisions to a government that believes that those decisions should be left to the men and women of Columbia. This election is very simply an election about who's on your side, who's really on your side.
It's about honesty.
Thank you very much, Mike Harcourt, Rita Johnston, and Gordon Wilson. I thank all three of you leaders tonight for your cooperation and your stamina this evening in this debate. And I would also like to thank my fellow colleagues here at the journalist table for their insightful questions. Thank you, gentlemen, very much. Well, debates in this country seem to have been very much akin and compared to prize fights. And outside the studio right now, there's a horde of journalists who are waiting to scrum these leaders and to determine who won or who lost. I don't know whether that ought to be our concern. If this has been illuminating tonight, if it's helped you to make your decision on what you've got to do in this election, then I hope to use a time-worn cliche that we've all been winners here tonight. Thank you for joining us. Good night.